The French defense is e4, e6. Most games continue d4, d5, and black's attacking the e4 pawn. If white defends it with knight to c3, then black can play the Winawer variation, which is to move bishop b4, pinning the knight. So black is now threatening to win the pawn. This is an attacking opening. It's not going to be dull. Black is not striving for a very slow equality. He's hoping to counterattack. The position will become imbalanced. In many instances, this bishop gets traded for the knight, and white's queenside pawn structure gets ruined. As compensation, though, with the missing bishop, not only does white have the bishop pair, but the dark squares on the king side can become weak for black. And a key move in the Winawer is the move queen to g4, attacking that g7 pawn, since it no longer has a bishop on f8 to defend it. All right, the main move here to deal with the threat on the e4 pawn is to push it. Very sensible. You gain space and you take away the f6 square from the knight. Okay, before we look at that, though, there are a few other moves I'm going to consider. If you want to, you can guard that pawn with bishop to d3, but it usually leads to a very equal game. So it's not the best way to strive for an advantage, but it does diffuse a lot of black's attempts to imbalance the game. Black can trade pawns here, gain a tempo on the bishop, and the bishop can retreat either to d3 or even f3 looks interesting. Okay, if it goes to d3, I should point out that this pawn is really not hanging. Black cannot take it because bishop to b5 check reveals an attack on the queen. Okay, so that's one safe way for white to play. Another way you might consider guarding that pawn I should caution against is the move f3. That's a mistake. Black can exchange pawns on e4. He can remove the defender of e4 and then play queen to h4 check, forking the king and the pawn. And black would have a much better position. Okay. Another way to deal with this pawn hanging on e4 is to actually gambit the pawn. And there are two ways to do that. One is the move bishop to d2, which has the interesting name, the Fingerslip Variation. It's probably called that because it looks like white has just slipped and forgotten about his e4 pawn. But he's doing this on purpose. For example, if black removes the defender of the e4 pawn and then takes it, then white can recover a pawn with queen to g4, forking a couple pawns here, and white's doing well. Black can improve on that line, though. Rather than taking the knight, black can take the e4 pawn, which unleashes an attack on the d4 pawn. Then if white plays queen to g4 to fork these pawns, black can take the pawn on d4 with the queen. And I'll point out some interesting tactics here. Some games have continued knight to f3. Keep in mind that's possible because the pawn is pinned to the queen. And rather than retreating the queen, it seems popular for players to play knight to h6 to counterattack white's queen. White can ditch his queen with queen takes e6 check, getting a pawn. Bishop would recover, and then white would get the black queen. And the game's about equal again. The computer gives it all zeros. I would actually prefer black slightly because black is a little bit better developed, and white still has to do something to recover this pawn. Okay, so that's the Fingerslip Variation. It's a rare continuation we won't really look deeply into. But another interesting move here that gambits the pawn is the move knight to e2. That's called the Alekhine Maroczy Gambit. And the point of this move is to support the knight on c3 so that if black does exchange, you can recover with your knight and not ruin your pawn structure. If black attempts to win a pawn here with, say, d takes e4 right away, then white can provoke the bishop with a3, and many players just retreat it to e7 and give the pawn back and play this like very similar to a Rubinstein variation. Probably knight to f6 comes next. And black will get in the move c5 at some point to attack the d4 pawn. And it's about equal. Okay, but if black takes the knight, then white can take back. And this is not really a true gambit, because the only way to guard this pawn is with the move f5. Knight to f6 temporarily guards it, but the knight would be pinned and white would get the pawn on the next move. But f5 seems to solidly guard it, but that's positionally a terrible move because of the move queen to h5 check, g6, queen goes somewhere, maybe h3, and yes, black has held on to his pawn, but look at the dark squared weakness on the king side. And black has no dark squared bishop, even if he did. There's a lot of dark squares to protect there. And white does have his dark squared bishop on this diagonal. So white has a strong advantage in that position, even though he's down a pawn. I guess this pawn on d4 is hanging right now, so maybe instead of retreating the queen back there, maybe the queen can go to d1 to protect it. Okay, so back to this position. So as I said, most players prefer to advance this pawn. Why not? You gain space, you take away these squares, and it's a good move. Okay, now there are a few different moves black can play here, but the main move we're going to concentrate on is the immediate c5 to attack the base of this pawn chain. Sometimes black delays that move and plays knight to e7, but that often transposes to the c5 lines. For example, if white plays a6, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, c5, then we get to the same position we normally get to with the move c5 pushed first and knight to e7 pushed later. So knight to e7 can be played. Another move some players have played in this position is the move b6 with the intention of getting the bishop traded off, since that's the bad French bishop behind this light squared pawn chain in the center. Now, if black does that, I think a good move here is probably queen to g4 right away and attack that g7 pawn. If in doubt, if you see something new, you should certainly always consider this move, queen to g4. Okay, but we won't look any deeper into that. Let's look at the move c5, which is played in a vast majority of the games. Okay, so that does attack the base of the pawn chain here. And this looks like the advanced variation, but the difference is white does not have the move c3 to support the pawn chain. So what white normally does about that is he plays a3, hoping this bishop will exchange itself, and then a pawn will appear on c3 to support the pawn chain. And this is a very interesting position where white has some weaknesses in his pawn structure on the queen side, but black has some trouble with the dark squares on his king side. The move queen to g4 will come soon. We will analyze this position and several continuations from it in future videos, but let's back up. There is an alternative black can try. Instead of taking the knight here, he can retreat the bishop. It's not great though. What you want to remember as white, if black does that, is the move b4. And that relieves the pin on your knight, and the purpose of it is you'd like to get the knight to this d6 square and disrupt black's castling rights. Okay. So after b4, the bishop is under attack. You don't want to retreat it and just give up the c5 pawn. So you're going to take a pawn here. And black has two choices. I think if you did not know this line at all, you would naturally take b4 here to save your bishop. But d4, taking on d4 is a possibility too, because that counterattacks the knight. Now both minor pieces are under attack. Let's look at taking on b4 first. If black does that, then you sink your knight on b5, heading for the d6 square. Now black can move the b4 pawn now and get a check. It's not advisable to take on a3, because after blocking the check, this is only going to open up the position and help white's development, and the king will be in danger. So instead, most players will get a check in by pushing to b3, okay, leaving that pawn in white's way. Then white can block with c3, and the move knight to d6 is coming. The only way to stop it is, if you want to stop it, is to move your bishop back to c7. Okay, but then white can play queen takes b3, maybe even queen to g4 here is a good move. But after queen takes b3, white is threatening to win the bishop pair and take black's good bishop and leave him with a bad bishop. And his queenside pawn structure doesn't look as bad as it did a little while ago with the pawn on c2. So white's doing really well in this position. Okay, but back to right here, okay, after black has retreated and white plays b4, the better move is to actually take on d4. I mean, you might as well take the base of the pawn chain, right, and make the center weaker for white. Okay, if black does that, you could take the bishop, but I wouldn't advise that, because now your pawns just look terrible over here. Okay, so instead you want to continue with the plan of playing knight to b5, threatening to come in here. Okay, then the bishop would fall back to c7 to protect that square and to save itself. And now notice the e5 pawn is under attack, so white will play f4 to support his center. This pawn will eventually fall, and white will get a pretty good position. So black doesn't normally want to retreat that Winawer bishop in the French. Something like this would happen. So back to here, when white plays a3, again, black will take the knight, and we will see this position. And I look forward to making some videos from this position in the future. Thanks for watching this one.